Well, today we're beginning our study on King David, and the story of David doesn't begin when he's first mentioned in 1 Samuel. Of course, David's story begins. It began long before, when God had told that there would be a king among His people at some point in their history. The way that we see David's story begin is in many ways the way that we judge things for ourselves. Israel chose their first king off of looks and stature. As we say today, they judged a book by its cover. This first lesson is about how we should look at things the way God looks at them and not the way that we usually do. So that's how David's story begins, is in that light. God had already ordained something, and we'll see how that will work out. Now, before we start reading some scripture, I want to ask you a question. It's the first question there, and you may know the answer, and I hope you do. But if you don't, we're going to cover some scripture, and it's going to tell us exactly what God had in mind. But that first question is, what was God's plan for Israel regarding a king? What was God's plan for Israel regarding a king? Does anybody know? All right, God was their king. Now, it's not a trick question, but that was God's intent, that He should be their king, but He did have a plan for a king. Now, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 17, because this tells us something. Now, obviously Deuteronomy 17 tells us something, because in Deuteronomy we know that the children of Israel are reaching the end of their 40 years of wandering in the desert, and they're reaching they're getting close to the promised land, and they're starting to retell some of the laws and things that are given. And there's something very telling about how the people are going to act once they get into the promised land. So in Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting with verse 14, I think I put the scripture references on your paper. If I didn't, I apologize, but I tried to remember to do that. Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting with verse 14. Now, if those of you who have a heading in your Bible, the heading in mine says Laws Concerning Israel's Kings. Now remember, Israel did not have a king, as a person, as where everybody else did. Now this is what was being told to them, said in verse 14, "When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me." Now this is talking well in advance, hundreds of years into the future. Notice he says, when you come to the land, he's saying that, see, they're not there yet. He's saying that when it happens, he's telling them, you're going to get there. And he says, when you possess it, they haven't done that yet. He says, so you're going to do that. You're going to possess the land. And then he says, and when you dwell in it. So they haven't done that. So he's telling me, you're going to do all those three things. You're going to get there, you're going to possess it, and you're going to dwell in it. So that all sounds fine and dandy. But then he says, and you will say, set a king over me. So he's telling them what they're going to do once they get there, once they enjoy the riches and the comforts of this land that he's giving them. He's telling them, say, look, you're going to ask for something for yourself. I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. So what is that implying?
He's going to tell them what to do.
Well, they're trying to tell God what they want to be done.
I know, but that don't work.
Well, we know that. But he's telling the people, he said, this is what you're going to say, this is what you're going to do. And basically, what he's telling them, he's saying that once you get there and you enjoy all this stuff, you're going to want what the world wants. Not what I want, you're going to want what the world wants. He said in verse 15, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priest, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that this heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Now, if we were to skip ahead, we know that Solomon would break every single one of these things to the T, because we know that Solomon acquired many horses. He sent people to Egypt to acquire more horses. He exceedingly had more silver and gold than any person in human history, as far as we know. And we do know that he had an excessive amount of wives. So I don't know if God was writing this specifically for Solomon, but Solomon fulfilled it to a T. But there's something there that says, God says, I will choose you a king. So God had a plan. God wanted to be their king. God did have a plan to bring them a king. Who do we call the King of Kings today?
Jesus.
All right, so God had a plan. That plan had been foretold long ago, even before all of this. So God had a plan. But he said, I will indeed, on that day, I will choose you a king for you. So God had all that planned out. And so that's where we would begin with all this. So looking at the question, what was God's plan for Israel regarding a king? So does that give you a little bit better understanding of what his mindset was? Now, let's read 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8. And we're going to read the whole chapter. Now, I know this is not specifically about David, but I think, as always, you know me, I want you to have context. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Because it's basically, we see a tale of two kings. We see how two kings are appointed or anointed. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting with verse 1. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. And they were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. So there is a prophecy several hundred years after God said it would happen. They did it. So this is almost 500 years after the fact when God said they would do this. So almost half a millennia had passed And they did exactly what God had said. They asked for a king to rule over them like the nations. Give me something that the world has. There's a lesson in there. In verse 6, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So another important lesson there. Verse 8, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt and even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so that they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. All right, so now he says, God's telling them, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Now, here, let me share with you how the kingship is going to work that they are going to choose. This is what they're going to have to endure. So in verse 10, so Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands, and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground, and some to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. So, do you see kind of what he's saying there? Before all this, God had appointed people himself in these battles, in these wars, because this was not the first time that they had ever fought anybody. Now he's saying, instead of God choosing all these people, you're going to have a king set over you, and he's going to make your people do this. Basically, he's saying your king's going to institute a draft, and they're not going to have any choice in the matter. As where before God, there was a choice. God chose who was going to go into battle. Now he's saying you don't have that choice. You've put it in your own hands. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. So he's saying what God has blessed you with, now the king is going to take the best of. Kind of sounds like the government. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the 10th of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. So God's saying, this is a punishment, basically. For rejecting me, here is your punishment. You wanted it, you got it. I don't know, I have to look at the Hebrew, but it might be there somewhere. In verse 19, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. All right, so notice that this was a warning. God had still given them a choice. You can still have me as king, or if I give you a king, this is what it's going to be like. This is the trouble it's going to cause you. And what did they say? But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. That almost sounds like Democrats. Don't listen to good sense. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. So God warned them. He said, I'm going to give you this, but you still have a choice. And they still chose otherwise. No different today. People still do that exact same thing today. People say, look, you can have freedom, prosperity, you can have the good things, that America was founded upon, and the people will still say, no, give us somebody corrupt, give us evil, and we're going to call it good. Turn it upside down, and we're going to say it's the right way up. Let us kill babies. These are the things. It is no different. People have not changed. That is one thing I will say over and over again. Cultures change. People change a little bit, with customs and traditions and things like that. But one thing that never changed is human behavior. It has been the same since time began. People will always be people.
Think of themselves.
Think of theirself, exactly. Now, let's skip over to 1 Samuel chapter 10. 1 Samuel chapter 10, starting with verse 17. Now, in between here, we kind of meet Saul. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit. It said, Now Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah. And he said to the people of Israel, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the land of the Egyptians and from the hand of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from all your calamities and your distresses, and you have said to him, Set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. So we see that Samuel obeyed the voice of the Lord. He did as the people instructed, and we meet Saul, and it tells us that whenever he saw Saul, Saul was a attractive man. He just had that glow about him. You see people like this on TV who are just, you look at them and you're just kind of drawn to them. They just have a look of, sometimes it's confidence or whatever it might be, good looks or whatever, nice hair, whatever it might be. But sometimes, people have an appearance that just you're drawn to. And not only that, it says that he was head and shoulders above everybody else. So I guess he fit the description. He was tall, dark, and handsome. Isn't that every woman's dream, having a tall, dark, and handsome man? So he fit the description of what you might expect or what you might want. And so he takes him before the people and he says, Look, here's your king. Here's the one that you wanted. Now in our second question, all right, after reading about Saul, now the reason I say, after reading about Saul, we didn't read everything about Saul. I think most of you kind of know how he was chosen. The question is primarily about how he was chosen. After reading about Saul and the way he was chosen, what can we take away from it? Or I should say, who chose him? All right, the people did. So what do we take away from that? I didn't choose him. Yeah.
The people, supposedly the majority, chose him.
Yeah.
Chose them, not just the president, but others
Yeah.
as well.
Well, I mean, we look at this in one sense. In one sense, this is political. This was a political choosing. But on the other hand, you got to remember that politics and religion, they commingled. Because not only was the king supposed to be the political leader who, he was the head of the army, basically. He gave the orders. He was basically like our commander-in-chief. Supposed to be one. But he held this function of a high ruler, supposed to be ordained by God as the high ruler of his people, to handle those affairs, with his servants and things like that. But he was also supposed to be a spiritual leader. If you remember in Deuteronomy 17, what did it say? It said that he was supposed to have a copy of the law. He was supposed to read it daily and live by it. And the copy that he had, it had to be approved by the Levitical priesthood. So there were stipulations about not only was this king supposed to be a political leader, but more importantly, he was supposed to be their spiritual leader. The person who led them in worship, the person who led them in how they were supposed to act. You know, this was the most important part of it. I think a lot of times we think more about the political part of it instead of the religious part of it, which was obviously, in my opinion, I believe was more important to God than the other part of it. Because if he's living right and he's living by the word of God, there's plenty of history to back it up that they will prosper. And we will see that in the next appointed king, at least early in his life anyway. Now let's read 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. 1 Samuel 16, verse 1. All right, so again, we're skipping ahead. We know that Saul, who had been appointed king, has had some trouble. And he's having trouble. We know that the Lord is not happy with him, which I guess we could have figured that out, because God didn't choose him. The people did. So he gave the people a dose of their own medicine. Now Saul, he reigned for a pretty good while. I think he reigned for about 40 years, I think. Somewhere along in there. So Saul reigned for a long time. And so when we get to chapter 16, it says, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons.'" So God has rejected Saul to Samuel, and he says, "Look, I've already got somebody else in mind, someone of my choosing." So, all right, so you can see the tale of two kings here, one in which the people chose, one in which God had chosen. So in that verse, question 3, what evidence is there in this verse that Samuel may be having trouble letting go of Saul? Yeah, he asks, how long? How long are you going to keep on doing this and not let him go? Now think about it. A lot of times you will hear me say something like people being conditioned to think a certain way or act a certain way. I think this is an example of that, because think back. Go back to what we just read. Samuel was not happy that the people wanted a king over God, right? He was not happy about that. It says that he was very disappointed. He was upset. Now, he's grieving over the people's choice.
He's unhappy because you gotta let it go.
Yeah. Right. So you can see how over 40 years' time people can be conditioned when initially they may not have liked it. So that can happen. So, that's just something to think about there. But that leads to the next question. Why did the Lord ask Samuel this question? Why did he ask Samuel, how long are you going to grieve over this? He wants to move on. He's wanting Samuel to see what he had saw previously. I did not choose this man. Yes, I allowed the people to have a king, but this was not my choice. This man was their choice. It didn't work out. And Larry, we can say that today when we do that. It still don't work out, does it? It still don't work out, does it? And here's a powerful lesson for us today. That sometimes God will give us exactly what we ask for. If we ask for bad leadership, guess what? Sometimes He'll give it to us
But is it God's will?
to teach us a lesson.
But is it God's will?
Well, if God did it, then yes, it's His will. Absolutely. If He allowed it.
That's what I'm saying.
If He allowed it, yeah, that's His will. Absolutely. Why do we have bad leadership in America? Well, because God's letting it happen.
We let it, but it might not have been God's will.
You don't think so? I think the Bible tells us otherwise. The Bible tells that people are in power because God allows it to be.
Well,
So if we have bad leadership, it's His will.
God allowed it to correct the people's attitudes.
Yeah, and don't you see a lot of people's attitudes being corrected today? I mean, now let me ask you this. What was it, last week? CNN had a town hall with Trump. That whole time they applauded. They applauded Trump. Have you seen that before?
And that
No.
That was turned around against
Yeah.
CNN.
Yeah, so I mean, you can see that people, once they have a dose of what they think they want, God says, okay, here you go. Have at it. Live it up. See how you like it. Now, am I going to,
And every time they come down on Trump for some stupid reason, it turns around in his favor.
it's funny how things work out, don't it? You know, am I going to say that Trump is the best guy for the job? No, absolutely not. I think there's probably better choices. But you know, yeah, yeah. But I mean, just the point I'm trying to make is that when people want what the world wants, sometimes God will give it to them. That's another thing that we find in Romans chapter 1. I think that's part of God's wrath if we read it, that when people want certain things that are against God's will, sometimes part of His wrath is just giving them exactly what they asked for.
But let me ask you a question. God's wrath, don't you think God chastises, say, the United States or for killing 75,000 babies?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know, they talk about slavery. Slavery is more rampant now than it's ever been. Ever been.
Yep, it still goes on. But that's a question that we can ask, people. We can ask, how long are we going to grieve over whatever? The thing that kept us from God's grace, or the thing that kept us from God's glory, how long are we going to grieve over that? God's got something for us if we can move on from it.
That's right. Move on and keep our eyes on Him.
So that's the point that He's trying to make to Samuel. How long are you going to refuse to look at what I'm going to do and what I wanted to do to start with? Don't grieve over this. Look to what I have ahead. Sometimes that's hard for us to do. All right, let's jump over and let's read, continue on with chapter 16. Let's start with verse 2. We're going to read down to verse 7. And Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you. Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, do you come peaceably? And he said, peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart.
Yeah.
All right, so in question 5, according to verse 7, how does God's judgment differ from ours?
His ways are higher.
God's got from the heart, all of us just
Because people can hide things. People can put on a show. But the thing that they can't do is they can't hide it from God, because God knows their heart. We may not, but God does. And so, it goes back to the saying that I said at the beginning. We have a saying, don't judge a book by its cover. And the same thing can be said for people. I love that this was a big church. It hired a new pastor. I'm sure you've heard this before. But the new pastor who was coming in had grown his beard out, got some clothes that looked like a homeless person, and that's what he was acting like. He was acting like a homeless person. And he sat outside the church, and then he came in, and nobody really wanted to speak to him. Nobody really wanted to talk to him. And he came and sat up front. Well, they ushered him to the back and said he would be more welcome back there. So they were basically saying, you're not welcome up here because of your appearance. So they weren't taking into account the man's heart. How did they know what the man's heart was? All they were basing it on was his appearance. And so after the deacons were in on this, so they knew what was going on. The people didn't. But after the deacons came up and they announced that they were getting a new pastor and that they were introducing him, the man who appeared homeless got up, walked to the front of the church, explained who he was and explained what he was doing, and basically led them in a self-reflection sermon that day. And he hoped that next week they would come back with a little bit different attitude. And I'm just saying this as a general statement, not something about Providence or any surrounding churches. I'm just saying this as a general statement. How many churches do that today? They look at people, maybe they know a little bit about them, maybe they see how they dress or, how they act or, the car that they drive or the job that they have, whatever. How many of us do that and automatically judge on appearance? I think we've probably all done that. I'm sure of it. I'm sure we've all done that. And people are still doing that today. The horror stories that I've heard from other churches, other pastors, my goodness. And that, church is the place where, this is a place where we should be, reaching out to people, and despite how they look or, sometimes how they smell or whatever, these are the people that we need to say, you know what, you're here, let's love on you. Let's love on you and let's treat you like God would. And we just, so often we don't do that. And again, I'm not speaking about Providence, I'm just speaking in general.
Like in that movie, Jesus Revolution,
Yeah.
where he says, they're getting the carpet dirty. Remember that?
Yeah, right.
He said, oh, so they've got dirty feet. Instead of the one
Yeah.
that's playing to get off see the movie. Next Sunday when they come, the pastor is on his knees washing everybody's feet as they come into the carpet.
Yeah. Yeah, and Chuck, is it Chuck Colson? Is that right? Chuck Colson. He was the pastor. He did not like hippies. He thought that that was something that God just would not accept. He didn't like the hippies, and he didn't want anything to do with them. And lo and behold, he said, well, said something to the effect, well, if God will send me one, then I'll talk to him. Lo and behold, God sent him one. Yeah. God sent him one. And he sat down with him and he started, he was judging outward appearances, and then he started He started seeing the heart. And, that did create a Jesus revolution in the 70s. Brenda McIntyre, she said, her and Larry, they cast judgment upon these people themselves. So, it's this whole thing about judging, generally it's best we leave it to God. But God judges from the heart, not from appearance.
It wasn't just long-haired people, they judged our military people. Like
Yeah, sure did.
back in Vietnam.
Sure did. Yep,
They was fighting for our freedom,
yep,
our country.
yep. That's a lot of times people judge for the wrong reasons. They judge for very selfish reasons.
That was a big move back in the 60s. Big move.
Yep.
That really changed the world.
Yep. Well, let's continue on. 1 Samuel 16, verse 8. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, Neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, Neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, The Lord has not chosen these. Then Samuel said to Jesse, Are all your sons here? And he said, There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and had beautiful eyes, and was handsome. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. All right, so we can see how God looked at the heart and not the appearance, because the first thing that Samuel saw when he met Jesse's first son, this was a guy who was similar to Saul. He was quite tall, handsome, and Samuel said, Surely this is the one. And God said, Nope, and kept on through the line. Nope, 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 nope. So in question 6, if you had been given the job of finding Israel's next king, why would David have been an unlikely choice? Huh? Profession? Yeah. Why was keeper of a sheep not considered a high-profile job?
That was a low life.
Yeah, it was lowly. 99% of the time, you were dirty. And if you've ever worked with animals, you can also become stinky. So he was dirty and stinky, but there was something else too. He was the youngest. He was the youngest of all the kids. Yeah. So, when you think about the things, if we were going to go out and say, you know what, I'm going to anoint the next king of Israel, would we have chosen David? More than likely we wouldn't, based on his appearance, his stature, his smell, all those things. So again, there was an appearance thing. Even his own family didn't even say, didn't even think enough of him to bring him in.
There's 7 brothers mentioned here.
Uh-huh.
For the Bible, there's not 7, 6 sons.
Yeah.
David,
Yeah. 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 I mean, it does. And, I think it says something about his dad who didn't want to card him before. Maybe that's not, because of what he's doing, because of his age, he's not significant. Exactly. You know, that's, and that's where we are, because, we make assumptions too, don't we? If I think there's a translation, in one of the Bibles that says something. I want to say maybe it's, like glowing appearance, something similar to that. I saw something about blush, like blushing cheeks or something like that. But I think it had something to do with his appearance.
Yeah, I think it's the opposite.
Like it was like he had kind of like a glowing appearance. Yeah. But since you asked, let me look at the Hebrew and see.
It's very detailed, they're saying he's ruddy.
Let's see. All right. One translation is that it's a term that means reddish, of the hair or of the complexion. So I had heard before previously that he was talking about his cheeks. But it's the same word that is used of Esau. When it was used of Esau, it meant red hair. So it can either mean hair or like a reddy appearance. In question 7, why do you think the Lord has Samuel look at each of Jesse's sons before revealing that he has chosen David?
They started out the best looking, but most of one was seemingly qualified.
Right. Yeah.
Every one of them, in the Bible, I think somewhere I read stated that each son would step down and maybe jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
David, he was on the bottom of that.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think that God was trying to teach Samuel a lesson here as well. Because again, when we look back, what was Samuel's first impression when he saw the first son? He already made an assumption based on his appearance. He said, this has got to be the one. And so God was teaching him a lesson, each and every one, because God could have just told Samuel from the very beginning, I'm going to choose David, none of the other ones. That's what he could have done. But, like with us, a lot of times God chooses not to skip to the end solution, but to teach us a lesson to get to the solution.
Saul selected king because he stood
God's way.
What's that?
Wasn't Saul selected as the king because he stood
Yes.
much taller?
He was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. Yeah.
Maybe that's why Saul had, he had the same,
Mm-hmm.
hey, that's why I got picked.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I do believe that he was teaching Samuel a lesson through each of the sons.